Welcome back. We're going to finish our woven pouch by decorating it. So we're going to create a lining inside of the pouch in the event, or just kind of to keep it sturdy so nothing falls out. So I'm using a piece of felt and I'm just kind of using the pouch as a guide to measure how big I want it. So I'm going to make it just slightly smaller than the outside of the pouch because the inside is smaller than the outside. And I'll just use a marker to give me my cutting guidelines. And I use the fold of the fleece for the bottom, that way I have less to sew. And once we've cut that, we're going to sew up the sides to keep it sewn together. Make sure you have a good knot at the end of your thread, that way we keep it in place. I usually run my first stitch through the knot, that helps keep it in place even more. And I'm just going to pin the felt in place to keep it from moving while I'm stitching. And I'm going to use a whip stitch to go around the sides. You can use a running stitch too, or if you have a sewing machine, by all means use that. It's much faster. So I'm just wrapping the stitches around the edge. So I'm staying close to the edge of the piece and wrapping around it. And I'm going to go up both sides and then tie it off. It's important that you tie a good knot to keep everything from unraveling. And you want to leave a little bit extra at the top of your felt when you sew it. That's going to keep it able to kind of fold over the edges when we get to that part. I noticed that my piece was just a little too big, so I needed to trim it down just a little bit so that it would fit neatly inside of the pouch without folding or wrinkling. So it's always a good idea to check these things as you're going along so you don't sew up both sides and then realize you have to start over again. So now I'll just stitch up the other side, same process. I go through the knot as I start and then do a whip stitch all the way up. So I've put the little felt pouch inside of the pouch, and then I'm going to make a little covering over the edge. So I've pinned the felt to the front side of my pouch, and I'm going to actually wrap that around once I've stitched across to cover up all those little warp threads that you see sticking through there. So I'm using a running stitch this time, and that's where you just go straight across. You aren't wrapping around anything. And I'm going to leave my thread attached once I get to the end of the top. I'm going to be wrapping around the edge once I finish with this process. So I've sewn across the top and I've taken the pins off, so now I'm going to actually wrap the felt around to the other side, and you see how that covers up the warp threads. I kind of push it around to get it into place. And then I'm going to actually sew that felt to the inner pouch so that it's all one piece. So I'm going to pin all that in place. And then I'm going to pin the front part of the felt pouch over the top of all those little warp threads on the front. So you see I've kind of left a little on the top and wrapped it over. and then I'll pin it in place so that we can sew it more easily. It's kind of tricky to pin it to keep all the threads in place, but once you have it, it should look nice and clean. And then I'll take the remaining thread and I'm going to whip stitch around the sides, and then to connect the flap part to the inner pouch, I'm going to use a running stitch and use a running stitch all the way around. Now I made a little strap to go there, so I'm going to pin that on and just sew it as I get around that part of the pouch. So I'll pin that into place. Another option you can do with these straps is to sew it into the inside of your pouch, so in between the pouch and the felt. That way you won't see any edges, but I wanted some tassels hanging, so I thought I would leave that out. So again, we'll use the whip stitch around the sides of the flap and then a running stitch on the inside. And when I get to the strap part, I'm just going to take the thread and kind of wrap around the strap, keeping it in place. So I'm going through it and around it. And lastly, we have a button to sew on to keep the flap closed when we need it. So I choose a button that kind of matches with my design, and I'll just sew that onto the front. You can sew it on before you sew the inner felt pouch, that way you won't see any thread, or you could just be careful to not go through the felt when you get there. That's what I'm doing right here. So making sure I'm sewing my button in an accurate place, so I'm constantly checking to make sure it's in the middle. And then I'm sewing it in a way that I'm not going through the felt. So I'm leaving a little extra thread so that I can get around it. And you'll notice there's a thicker black piece of yarn right above the pouch, and that's going to be the other attachment for the button. So I'm going to make, it's actually a piece of tightly braided yarn, and I'll make a little loop to slip the button through at the top of the flap. And again, you can sew that into the inside, in between the lining and the pouch if you want. It's up to you. You could also use Velcro to keep the things together. Any sort of closure mechanism that you want to put together is perfectly fine. So I'm checking the distance between the loop and the top of the pouch, and then pinning it in place so that we know it's the right size. And then we'll just sew through the braid and then around the braid to keep it in place. And when you're finished, you'll have a nice little pouch that you can store money, smartphones, tablets, anything you can think of. And we're all finished.